That's it, a bit of enthusiasm.
That's lovely, thank you. Okay, good evening and thank you for being here. And thank you especially to Philip for accepting to have this conversation with us. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you. By way of introduction, I should say that Philip is an Irish-born writer and translator, currently living in Bucharest. He won the 2006 Rooney Prize for Irish Literature for his first collection entitled Notes from a Turkish Whorehouse. This collection also won the 2006 Glenn Dimplick's New Writers Award. He's also the first Irish writer to be shortlisted for the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award for his second collection entitled The Pleasant Light of Day, which was published in 2009. He speaks 6 languages and has translated Michael Sebastian's autobiographical novel entitled For 2,000 Years. Critics have praised his ambitiousness with the short story shape and his break from the grip of ingrained Irish modes. So, taking these 2 comments as a cue for my first kind of idea on the work of Philip, can you tell us in what way is the shape that you give your short stories ambitious? And in what way do they break from the grip of ingrained Irish modes?
The second one is easy because it's completely accidental. You know, writing mostly, I think most writers, you're starting out not with a clear concept of where you're going. It never starts out so clear. And the idea that I started writing short stories to do something new in terms of how Irish short stories were conceived is... No, it sounds great, you know, I love it when I read something like that because it sounds like I'm really clever and I had a strategy, but of course it wasn't like that. I left my own country, I went to another one, I went to Romania. My problems were personal, they weren't literary in any sense. And the fact that I was writing was a response to my personal confusion. And only later I started having a sense myself of what I was doing.
Okay.
And then you see that other people are reacting to what you're writing. So you do become self-conscious and able to analyze your work in a different way after the fact. But it didn't start out like that, no.
Okay, so you went to the short story genre as opposed to the novel, perhaps, or the longer kind of novella style. I mean, you have a partiality for the short story more than you would have.
Yeah, again, I work very intuitively, and I've never really, starting out, I never really asked myself what I was going to, what form I was going to write in, what length it would take. That revealed itself as I went along. Living in a commercial reality, you know, you're asking how you're going to survive writing at some point. You obviously you're going to try to write something longer, but it always falls apart for me as it gets longer. I have written things, I have written novels, but I always destroy them in an attempt to make them acceptable to myself. Well, I've done it twice, but life is short, and I can't keep going on like that, you know. And I've come to understand that there's something unconscious that I'm doing that I enjoy. I enjoy the process of it, and I enjoy at a certain point. It becomes conscious to me towards the end, But I think to write something longer, novel length, you can't work that way. You have to have a larger sense of what you're doing. And at that point, it dies for me. I lose it. I lose interest in it. And I could possibly analyze that and find out the reason for it, but it wouldn't change anything, I think.
All right. So you have so far two collections of short stories, two collections here, the Notes from a Turkish Whorehouse and The Pleasant Light of Day. These titles then appear as short stories themselves in each of the novels, in each of the collections, sorry.
Yeah.
So what came first, the title of the book or the short story, if I may ask? Do you remember?
Each short story is individual. I'm doing it one at a time, and the collection appears afterwards. You know, I was writing the first book. What happened was I moved to Bucharest in the year 2000. At a certain point, I think I just became desperate with my life and I tried all the other simple solutions. You know, I suppose when you're in your 20s and 30s, you're trying different things to figure out what you're doing in this life and why it's unsatisfactory. And first of all, you try the easy things. You change job and you travel and you fall in love and you fall out of love and you start writing stories. And for me, the only thing that seemed to provide any relief was the making of something from this experience of dissatisfaction, was putting it through this process by which it was altered. And for me, that was the short story. It was this way of interpreting my own experience that relieved my suffering. If that doesn't sound, I suppose it sounds dramatic, but that's what I was doing. That's what I was doing. So I finally moved to Bucharest in the year 2000 because it was a place I figured that I could afford to live, because it was in a terrible state, the country, at that stage. And I figured all I need now is just enough money to feed myself, and I can do my scribbles, and if no one buys them, I don't have to worry about it. You know, I can be a loser, and at least if I'm a loser, I can do it in some kind of slightly more dramatic way that will feed my own perverted egotism. And, you know, that's what I did. And then the stories just accumulated, and at one stage they became publishable.
All right. So, as you said, when I read your collection, one of them I had already read, but then, of course, I went back to it when I knew I would have this conversation. There is the sense of the intuitive, of the spontaneous, something that is almost coming out of a consciousness, which is being activated at that very moment as you're writing, as if, you know, the narrator is describing what he's seeing there and then without having thought about it. For instance, if I may refer to one of the short stories, which is Notes from a Turkish Whorehouse, the narrator says, and I quote, "Sitting down again for lines that ran and flowed and surprised even me, the creator." Then you say again, he says again, "I was the conduit for a magic energy. I was possessed of it." And then the writer is described as the delivery boy, elated and humble, unquote. So delivering the goods, as if the writer is really a conduit through which inspiration works and is transmitted then to the reader. And you call this moment a holy time. And as if, you know, this comes close to calling art sacred in a way. So in a style, I mean, throughout the short stories now, not only that story, but it's a style that I thought generally resists any sort of revelation, any sort of epiphany. So are these words in themselves revelatory of what the writer is doing, as if, he is just the transmitter as opposed to him being the creator. And kind of taking a cue from this idea, I could sense that a few of the stories themselves are about the art and the act of writing. And Notes from a Turkish Whorehouse is, I think, one such example, if I got it right. And in fact, the story ends, I wrote the title across the top of the page, and then the words began to come, unquote. So is this also a reflection of your own creative process? Can you tell us something about how writing comes to you? What inspires you? I don't know.
Yeah.
I thought it's all there.
Yeah, it's one description of the process. And it's a description that's a particularly extravagant description of the really fine moments you have when it's working.
Yes.
And that is what it's all about. It is about finding these moments, these really transformative moments. It is like something magic, because it's beyond. There are moments that are beyond analysis. And beyond your own understanding, and that's the joy in it, which is to escape, to transcend this part of yourself, which is always mired and judging. You have these moments which feel like freedom or joy. But as I said, it's one description of it. It isn't the full description of it. It can't be. The full description of it is actually that there's spontaneity is only, you're only granted spontaneity as a result of the discipline of work.
Of course, yes.
And there's no way around that. We'd like to dream that there's a way around this, but there's not. And you can see it in the writers who are most are given as examples of great spontaneity. Like Kerouac, who had this spontaneous writing style. As an admirer of jazz, that music should be spontaneous. But you read his early
almost improvised.
Sorry?
Almost improvised.
Yeah. But you read his early diaries. He labored constantly, writing every day, obsessively writing, to be able to put himself into this position where he could have moments where he had this flow, and it would occasionally produce something that was close to spontaneity that would be worth keeping. But even On the Road, which is his only really great spontaneous work, was edited. After that, because he was famous, he didn't get edited as much, and his spontaneous work wasn't as great. But I'm constantly fascinated by the labor that goes beyond that enables this effect, the effect which allows us to feel. Allows us to feel emotion. Now on YouTube, I'm constantly. Of course, you don't want to read all the drafts that a writer's written. That's horribly boring. But I go to, I'll find some song I like. I'll go, okay, Elvis Presley, Kentucky Rain, and I'll listen to that song, and it sounds, that's a fantastic song. But then I'll find where he's been in the recording studio, and I'll listen to his first 13 takes, where he's just going over it and over it and over it. And the first one is, it's not good. And the second is, okay, we try the snare drum here, baby, and come in a little later with the piano. And he goes through all these different things. And for some reason, I'm attracted to this. I'm obsessively attracted to watching the way musicians work in this way, because I see it gives me some kind of I don't know, relief or vindication from the monotony of my own labor. Short stories, they really have to have that sense of spontaneity. They either work or they don't work, you know.
Yes, yes, yes.
And in some ways they need to even hide their construction, hide their effort. For that reason, they often require more consciousness and effort in the editing, you know.
Yes, okay. So what you're saying really is...
I should have just come in and said, no, I wrote those in an afternoon. I poured myself a glass of wine. I was very relaxed. They all came out and I won a prize.
Yes, I mean, as you
great.
say here, you know, I wrote the title at the top of the page and then the words came. Okay, that's wonderful.
The words came, yes. You know, sometimes the words come, but
yes,
they come
yes,
after
yes.
a lot of
Absolutely,
other stuff
absolutely.
too.
So as if, you know, the secret of a good performance is making it sound easy. You know, but behind all that is a lot of rehearsing, a lot of hard labor.
Which the audience don't need to know about and they don't want to know about, and that's the way it is.
You know.
Yeah.
Okay, so to develop this point a bit further about spontaneity, about the sense of the improvised, as it were, to refer to another story, this time from the pleasant light of day, The Alchemist. And over there, Pablo says, and I quote, "If I ever write a book, I won't introduce more than one character every 3 pages. That way, the reader can get used to the new person and will not confuse them with any others. I'll make the characters very distinct and significant to the story. I won't have characters who turn up for no reason, the way they do in real life." Unquote. That's what's in the book. Then, at right at the end of the story, I thought was fascinating, really. There is an editorial note from the publisher. Of course, I mean, it's all contrived over there. A sort of an apologia for not following up certain points introduced in the story, which goes directly against what Pablo says in the quotation above. So there's a reference to the coins which Pablo's father gave his son, the bone allegedly taken from Napoleon's toe, and there's also the Englishman, I think, who comes in a significant way and then departs without anyone noting anyway. So, is this an ironic comment on the question of realism, authenticity, and relevance of detail, in the sense, kind of, the story has a strong dose of what I saw was a sort of magic realism about it, and so things happen randomly without explanation or justification. So what can you say about this?
Let's see now. This story was called The Alchemist, wasn't it?
Yes.
All right. So it was a parody of a book that sold a lot more copies than any of my books did. Right, and it's just a funny story behind that. You know, listen, I was in Iran, when was it? It was over, it was 10 or 12 years ago. And I had the most erotic experience of my life in Iran. I was in this taxi, and this girl, she held my hand in the taxi. We kind of liked each other. But it didn't go further than that. This is why I'm able to talk about it. It didn't go further than that, because, you know, if you mess around in Iran, you get your head cut off if you're a Christian. So I was a bit more cautious than I usually would have been. But this girl, I remember she was telling me I should stay in Iran. And she was telling me that she was trying to explain this as some kind of destiny, you know, me and her, and I should hang around in Iran and get my head cut off. And she said she'd read this book by Paulo Coelho called The Alchemist. Okay. Because this book it gets around everywhere, talking about translations. It must be one of the most translated books in the world. It gets everywhere. It gets to India, it gets to Iran.
Yes,
absolutely everywhere, and sells, because everyone can understand it. There's something universal about it. And of course, because this woman wanted me to die for her, I was curious, you know, and when I got back to Romania, I actually bought the book and I read it. And I couldn't believe how ridiculous, what nonsense it was. You know, it was so bad. It was just so bad that it just begged to be parodied. No, it was nearly a parody already. You know, it was just. I didn't have to do anything. You know, I just had to kind of take it up 1 degree, and the story was written.
Yes, we could see that.
So I'd read a couple of pages, and I'd type, and I'd go back. And some people thought it was silly, and some people thought it was funny, but I can't really say more about it than that. Okay. It was just kind of one of these things I had fun with, and I think at some point I became conscious of how silly writing could be. I don't know. I can't remember.
Okay. Right. Another story which I thought was fascinating is Song of Songs.
Song of Songs.
Song of Songs, and naturally
which is a book from the Bible, in case anyone doesn't know.
Exactly. That, of course, I mean, creates rings a little bell, because of course it's an evocation. The title, an evocation of the biblical Song of Songs, obviously. Now, it also juxtaposes magic realism and, about the flying and the coming back down on the bed, and naked realism, quite literally. So there's a lot of sex happening there.
I should say, I just tell the people, because I don't think anyone here has read any of these stories. There's a guy, he sees a woman in the street, and she's got the most beautiful ass he's ever seen.
Yes.
And he starts to follow her, which, well, anyway. Yeah, I think it's called stalking. And he goes back to his house, and he has a dream about her, and he finds he's starting to float. And then he goes to her house, and then he tries to get it on with her. She's not into him because he doesn't seem the type. But then he tells her he can fly, so he starts to float, and then she's more impressed. And,
yes,
and
absolutely.
They do the thing.
And then they get on, yes.
They get it on, yeah. As Marvin Gaye would say.
Yes.
Let's get it on.
Of course, the biblical Song of Songs is also about sexual desire, but transmuted, of course, differently in symbolism and allegory and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Now, what I saw from my reading, I mean, I don't know whether I'm being fanciful here, but in your other story, in your first story on notes from a Turkish whorehouse, and I'm referring to The Neighborhood now, that long story in the neighborhood, right? In that story, which comes before the Song of Songs, because that belongs, I don't know whether it comes before chronologically, the way you wrote them, but it appears in the second volume, the Song of Songs story, right? Now, in The Neighborhood, we have one of the voices. You know how many voices there are there? There are many characters emerging from everywhere. Now, Alex, one of the characters, reads a letter sent to him by his editor. You know what I mean? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay,
good.
if you want to read it to them.
So I just read this bit.
This is fascinating. Listen to this.
And this is the letter from the editor. So, dear Mr. Duhovi, I'm afraid our magazine cannot publish any of these stories either. Frankly, the attitude to women becomes more than a little grating. On Her Tale, the story where a man has a relationship with the backside of a woman he sees in the street, where he follows her around all day and where they have entire conversations without the actual woman participating in any way, is cleverly constructed and amusing in its way, but ultimately the subject of the stalking of women by mentally unbalanced men needs a sensitive treatment. And you do not give it one. I think you know what I mean. Yeah. Should you ever attempt a different kind of story, we would be interested in seeing it. Yours truly, blah, blah, blah. So does this fantasy find its way in Song of Songs?
I was unpublished when I wrote that, and everyone was telling me I shouldn't write all these dirty stories, you know. But I had the idea for that story. Or no, some kind of story like that. No, I like that title, On Her Tale. That's good.
Okay, On Her Tale, yes, absolutely.
That's good. Good title. Yeah.
So that's that story now, because Alex couldn't publish it. Does it find its way in Song of Songs?
No,
Because it's
just-
exactly the same.
No, I knew I had
All right,
to write
okay.
a stalker story at some stage. I didn't have the floating bit at that point.
All right, okay.
But I knew I'd have to write something really disgusting that was kind of like that at some point, yeah. And I can't remember how the levitation idea came to me, but that helped it. And actually what made it possible wasn't the levitation as so much as the Song of Songs. I just like that mix of registers.
Yes,
Because
yes.
I actually, I mix up quotes from the Bible.
And
He
you-
actually starts to quote the Bible as he
You
as he
quote a
starts
lot
to
from the
fly,
Bible, yes, and
you know?
it flies, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. He's praising her ass and sing and giving verses from the Song of Songs, and he's taking off, and yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, okay. So, something about your style. I found it very direct. The prose is very clear. There are vivid images which are completely divested of metaphor or simile. Yet, despite the lack of symbolism, or perhaps because of it, most of the stories have a quiet poignancy about them that it is at times deep and painful. You get first-hand experience, unfiltered by memory, as it were. Now, so given the clarity of your prose, the here and now, when a simile appears, it struck me as being, you know, it's there for a reason. For instance, in one of your stories, The Pleasant Light of Day, and the story I'm referring to is You Believe in God, with the exclamation mark, with the question mark at the end.
Leaving what?
You believe in God.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Story.
and I'm referring to.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got this thing here. The map of the city stared dumbly back at him. He had walked among the poor, and it had not been interesting. He could not make it mean anything, like a story he could tell to somebody else. So that simile over there, almost submerged simile, as it were, is it a meta-comment on your own writing? Kind of, is meaning always deferred, or is meaning necessary at all? Are we meant to understand anything, or just how do we react as readers?
Is meaning necessary? It's the only thing that's necessary.
Okay.
Well, of course, there's food and drink and shelter, but beyond that, it's the only thing that's necessary.
Yes, I thought so.
And without it, everything falls apart. As individuals or societies, or anything else. And one of the funny things about the society we live in now is the tremendous amount of choice we have, as if this should finally deliver us, and that comfort could give us happiness and relieve us. But it's not.
Okay.
The choices we're given don't relieve our anxiety about having to choose. The comfort we're given doesn't relieve our pain except temporarily. It displaces it somewhere else. And the only way we can live is by not knowing what we're doing, and by making mistakes and making the wrong choices. And out of that, making some kind of a story of it that can provide us with some kind of sense that will let us look towards the future, as opposed to just killing ourselves. And when I went to Bucharest 20 years ago, I was, when I wrote the first book, I was living in this apartment block, 10-story apartment block, typical Bucharest thing in a society that had basically disintegrated. Had been disintegrating for a long time. Had been through fascism, and then had been through communism, and then in this block, these were 30 square meter apartments, one after the other, 10 stories up, and one after another. And there were a lot of old people, a few workers, but the mood was not good. It was 10 years after communism. These were people who had worked all their lives for in this system, and had been told quite late on that it made no sense, and they could see that themselves. Delivered into this new system that was supposed to give them something, but couldn't even give them the minimum materially. And it wasn't a happy place. These weren't people who could go beyond their neighborhood, didn't even have enough money to go beyond their neighborhood, even into the center of center of the city, and find some diversion in that sense. So it was really in your face, the failure. There are a lot of crazy people, a lot of angry people, a lot of frustrated people, and I was there, you know, trying to write my stories too, and I had my own frustrations, and it kind of somehow it came together. So I was writing about place in as concrete a way as I could, with all these experiences and happenings around me and the people. But at the same time, I was dealing with this central thing that interests me, is how do people simply go on and make sense in this kind of a situation? Everything tells you that you should give up, and you don't. People do go on. And for me, the act of writing was the same response. It was the same thing, and it was the same positive. It was a positive response. There are only positive responses. That's what we do.
Yes.
Yeah.
To take a cue from what you're saying about, you know, the individual living in a specific place, but he goes about life like a vagabond.
Who does?
The narrators. I mean.
Oh, the different narrators.
The different narrators in the stories. They are like vagabonds. They are wanderers. You know, nameless most of the time, starving, not knowing where they're going to spend the next night, etc. So there's a sense of displacement, frustration, dislocation even. And there's no real attempt on the part of the narrator to, I'd never found it anyway, trying to make connection with a significant past, as if there is no memory. So no epiphanies, no recognitions, which would perhaps enable the individual to cope better with his predicaments. In fact, in one of your interviews, which I read online when I was preparing for this, you say, "We all get tired being civilized and want to get drunk," unquote. And the characters in your stories do get drunk on vodka most of the time. It's almost all the time vodka and sex. Then, in Notes from a Turkish Whorehouse, specifically the story called Reporting the Facts, which I loved a lot, the narrator says, and I quote, "I replied in the language of my ancestors, to which I have a sentimental attachment," unquote. And then he replies in Irish. So is it an honest attempt on the part of the narrator to bridge kind of his insignificant here and now with something that could possibly nurture him? Going back to his language? I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to read that, because it was one isolated instance where I found kind of the narrator trying to grapple with some kind of a past which had a sentimental attachment. Perhaps I'm reading too much.
Yeah, I think the word is sentimental, probably.
Or is it ironical? I don't know.
No, I think we all have this desire to attach ourselves. To things in the past, whether they're sentimental in the superficial sense or not is another question. You know, there's all kinds of superficial nationalisms that we can attach ourselves to that are ultimately fictions. And then at the same time, there's fictions which are quite profound, which we are inevitably attached to because they're meaningful. It's worth thinking about that, you know. There's a rejection of, you know, like everyone my age, there's been a rejection of
Yes.
religion and stories about the past. Particularly, I'm Irish, and I grew up inside what I can only call a theocratic state. And like most people of my generation, I rebelled against that. No, I heard recently Sinead O'Connor says she's a Muslim now. She was in my class at school. She's the same age as me. You know, I know where she's coming from. And I know where our madness is coming from too. At the same time, it can go too far. And now I live in Romania, where there's also a similar dichotomy. It's more of a dichotomy exists now in Romania between the people in the country who believe and the clever people in the city who see the Orthodox Church as this retrograde organization. And I recently had to decide if my kid should go to religion classes in school. Theoretically, they can opt out, but in fact, it means they can sit in the hallway. But I just let her go to the religion classes. She loves them. They sing songs. They draw pictures of Jesus. There's all these magnificent stories that they hear. And I don't see a danger in this. I see a value in hearing these stories that are old and bind us together and are actually meaningful. They're meaningful because people repeated them for a long time. You don't have to be stupid because you find meaning in them. You know, like today I was trying to remember what I knew about Malta. And the only thing I knew about Malta was when I was 9, drawing pictures of St. Paul being bitten by a snake. There was a shipwreck and he was bitten by a snake. I couldn't remember anything else about it. But I remember drawing that picture of a snake. And it was meaningful when I did it. It was meaningful enough that I remember it now. And it was meaningful because snakes are meaningful for us, as the good doctor told us, you know, the Viennese guy and all that. And he knew it because he read the Bible too. You know, we don't have to reject every story because
Absolutely.
it came from a certain direction.
Absolutely.
I want my little girl I want her to go hear all those stories and hear them from me too, and say a few prayers. And later, if she wants, she can reject them and find out how much meaning there is in it. But not just turn our back on everything that came before.
Yeah.
It's too much work to create meaning from the beginning.
Exactly.
It's too much.
And this, throughout the stories, I felt most of the time you locate them in a specific place. For instance, the first collection from the Turkish Whorehouse, Romania, Bucharest specifically, features a lot. But throughout, even the second collection, there are stories in Egypt, in Arizona, in New York, I don't know, in Turkey, and one story in Galway, one story in Andalusia. So
In Norway?
Galway.
Oh, Galway.
Galway,
Okay,
Galway,
yeah.
Ireland.
Just checking.
No.
Yeah, that's right. It
Okay, all
it
right.
was in Galway. Yes, yes.
Okay. So, how important? But I mean, so you have these spaces and locations which have their characteristics. So if it's New York, you have your own preconceived ideas about the place. Galway, about it, you know. So, however, the consciousness of the narrator seems to be the same. It seems as if it is the same person speaking in different places. That's how it came to me. That's how I heard his voice. So, are you telling us something there that, I mean, irrespective of space or time, we're all the same. We react. It's according to how our disposition is towards life. And secondly, how important is space for you, for location for your stories? I mean, if the story which is based in Manhattan had to happen in Bucharest, would it have been the same?
When I hear you saying that, I think I just must be writing about myself all the time, which I suppose is true. And I suppose is one of my limitations, you know? It's one of my limitations to the degree that how well am I actually doing it, you know? That's the limitation. I think there is a lack of interaction between characters and social reality there. You know, if there's a criticism of what I'm doing, that's surely it. What was...
No, I mean, about place. I mean, locating
place,
stories in
yes.
specific spaces. I mean, if, for instance, the stories in Bucharest were to happen elsewhere, would they happen? Or is it space and the location which makes the story happen?
It doesn't matter to me. I don't know how much it matters. I only know that I'm someone who has moved around, and I do use place as a form of stimulation, but I also use things I read and things I hear and things that happen to me as a form of stimulation. I just use whatever works. I do that, and I'm become more conscious that I use Bucharest, which is the city where I live, gradually in a more abstract way. You know, at one point I felt I was looking for quite specific things, and now I become more conscious of the fact that I'm just using it as a space that's sufficiently abstract. And I feel this as someone who's not from the place, but as someone who's lived in the place, sufficiently abstract that I just use it as I get what I want from it in terms of the story I'm doing. It's opportunism. It's opportunism.
Yes.
If I'm imagining a story, if I'm imagining people in a room, I imagine a room I've actually seen. I don't invent a room because I'm too lazy, and I've seen so many rooms. They're there for me already, and I use the one I want. You know, it saves me time.
Yes.
It's easy.
All right,
it's easy. I just use what I got.
Yes, and sometimes an aspect of your
And
style.
I bet Kafka did the same thing.
Okay.
I bet he did. He didn't have to describe everything he'd seen in the room. He just took from it what he wanted.
Yes.
And left the left. What he had was the feeling that it was a real place.
Yes.
And any crazy thing could happen in that room. But he had the feeling of the walls and the feeling that it was solid underground. And the fact that he had that feeling and could take the details he wanted communicated itself to the reader. And you find that even in the most fantastic writers, that there's something concrete there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And an aspect of your style which struck me, which I liked a lot, is that it's very forthright. You hit hard when you have to hit hard, if you know what I mean. So, for instance, in the story, As I Sink Down, you write, I was making her suffer by talking about impossible things. And then in The Neighborhood, which I need to speak about a little bit more detail, you write this, sex made a sucker of you. And then you were back face to face with nothingness, staring at the bathroom tiles, washing away the evidence of another human being. And later, on the same pages, you write, poverty was loving only the things you could not afford. in fact, the descriptions of sex are very vivid and graphic, and always from the man's point of view. There seems to be an idea that sex for these characters is a raw desire, totally independent of emotional connection. And more often than not, it leaves these characters briefly fulfilled, but disenchanted in the end. I mean, it's a sense of I don't know, I might have got it wrong, but it prevails throughout the stories. That it's something which is fulfilling momentarily, but then, you know, what's the next one? Where do we go?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure what I should add to that.
No, because I felt it across many stories, so I just wondered whether there's something that you need to expand on that. I don't know. Sorry.
I definitely should. I should develop as a person, probably. Really, I don't know what
That's
to
all right.
say.
That's fine.
Yeah.
But more specifically now, and now let's forget the sex. The worldviews that are presented in the stories are...
No, let's not forget the sex. Let's try to actually figure out what's going on here.
All right.
You're saying that it's basically men having sex and they're not satisfied. With experience, emotionally, and then...
It's always from the male point of view. In fact, the stories do give us only a male point of view, except for one story, which is A Time for Everything. That's the girl.
In the second book? Or in the first book, Honey?
In the pleasant light of day.
Yeah, okay. Mostly it's the male point of view, absolutely. That's true. And that's partly a choice.
It's a conscious choice? It's a conscious... you do it deliberately?
The first two stories I had published, I remember, they were written from the woman's point of view.
Oh.
Very first two stories I had published. And I won a prize for the second one, and everyone told me how sensitive I was and everything like that. And I realized that I had a great future as a woman writer. You know, I was made. It's easier for people to praise you if you write from a certain point of view. If you seem like I've said enough. It's easier. You're more appreciated if you say things from a certain point of view, and you're cozy with the reader somehow. And I think it became clear to me very early that there was actually more to be gained by a perspective that made the reader uncomfortable, maybe, or asked a little more from the reader, or didn't ask the reader necessarily to identify with the narrator or the point of view. No, it's too easy to do that. It's too easy to do that, and it at a certain level, it's a game of you accept that you're going to alienate a certain part of potential readers who are going to give up early and say, okay, I don't like that, I don't accept that. And you're going to give an extra something to the other readers who accept the, what would you call it, the provocare, the challenge, I suppose.
All right.
Who transcend the discomfort, the initial discomfort, or else just get off on it. I don't know. It doesn't mean you have to dislike it from the first. But I just enjoyed that. I enjoyed it mostly as a writer, not as someone seeing, you're looking at someone dragging chairs. It's okay, let them drag the chairs.
I'm not distracting.
I just found it more interesting to play with that way of writing.
Okay, all right.
It's punk rock. That's what it is.
That's perfectly fine. That's fine.
You know, as a musical style, it's punk. You know, you go, huh, puh, you're the audience. I don't give a fuck. Yeah, you know. That's what it is. But you know, you're right. there's literary readers out there. So you're playing with it from both sides, you know?
True. For instance, then you come up with such lines as, I'm referring to the story, reporting the facts. And you write there, I thought it was lovely, it was this little girl who the world hadn't touched. And later, in that same story, you also write, I quote, in that terrible city which wears you down, there are women who know how to make things beautiful, to put grace in simple acts. So kind of the mellowness in such lines, which are not very common in the stories, I felt they kind of try to transcend the sordidness of man's condition, of mankind's condition, kind of the poverty of spirit, the poverty of, I don't know, condition, the environment in which he's working. So, and then such lines come up, as if, you know, these are the lines that dreams are made on, to quote Prospero. So, I mean, do you consciously write those types of lines sometimes?
I live in a city that, well, Bucharest, a city that is, has suffered a lot. Before the fall of communism, you had a dictator who actually bulldozed a large part of it. He demolished it. I arrived a few years after that, when they were trying to put things together again a little bit. But the sense there was always of a city that had been at war with itself, had been consciously, deliberately destroyed. I mean, there's been cities in Europe that have been destroyed in wartime, bombarded, worse than Bucharest. But I think Bucharest is the only one which has been destroyed to that extent, deliberately, actually demolished. Apart from all the generalized suffering which was inflicted upon the people by the regime. And then you had the years after that, which was just like dreariness of the disappointment of what was coming afterwards, which was supposed to be the liberation of communism. And on top of that, you have this strangely moody city, which is this continental climate. You know, you have these hot summers where it's kind of tropical and all the greenness comes out. And then you have these winters where everything dies and it becomes utterly grey, and you feel like you're going back decades, you know.
Yes.
And it's a rough place from many points of view. And when the beauty comes at you, it comes at you sometimes in surprising ways, you know. You never feel that everything's utterly crushed. There's always these moments when it's coming back at you. And I think I wanted to express that kind of contrast.
Yes, lovely. It does come out very clearly. I'm told it's almost time. Can you tell us about your next project? Do you have anything in mind?
My next project. I have projects, and sometimes things work out, and sometimes they don't, and I never know. But I hope there'll be another book of short stories very soon.
Well, we look forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you.
Thanks.